out here.
I know, it's nice.
Look at these little bugs.
Oh yeah, look at all them. It's gross.
They're everywhere.
You see that?
Welcome to the fort. I'll be getting started pretty soon. There's plenty of shade. You can use the whole length of this wall. You'll be able to hear me. I'll use the speaker.
I'm sure all of this right here was the interior like that other one. Remember?
Talk pretty soon. Hope you're free to stand in the shade or stand out in the sun with me and sweat a little bit more.
That's okay.
Yeah, I didn't think many people think it. All right, looks like everyone's listening here. Testing. Okay, it does work. Let's get it. So, welcome again to Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter has meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people over the course of its history. Fort Sumter is obviously where the American Civil War first erupts. The first battle of that 4-year bloody Civil War occurs here, April 12th to 13th, 1861. Surrounding Confederate batteries from distant Fort Johnson, James Island, you passed that on your way out here, from Sullivan's Island, and also from Morris Island to our south behind the back wall of the fort. If you stand up top, it'd be to your right. So, Confederates are certainly victorious in that 34-hour bombardment, compelling the U.S. Army garrison, just roughly 80 men, under the command of Major Robert Anderson, to agree to terms of evacuation. So Fort Sumter quickly symbolized for the victorious Confederates the birth of their nation and the symbol of their victory at the opening of the war. But what did Fort Sumter represent before the American Civil War, before South Carolina seceded from the United States of America in December 1860, which really prompts everything that occurs here, really why the American Civil War begins here in Charleston and not someplace else. Well, Fort Sumter would have represented an impressive architectural achievement. It would have represented the power of the U.S. Army. It's part of a large expansion of fort construction in the years before the American Civil War. It would have been one of about 50 forts being constructed as a result of the War of 1812, when the British burned down our Capitol and the White House in Washington, D.C. President James Madison addresses Congress and says, we clearly need to improve seacoast defense. So that's the story of Fort Sumter's construction. If you look up top at the flagpole, Fort Sumter, before the devastation of the American Civil War, stood as tall as the base of the flagpole to that red line on the flagpole. So about 50 feet, 3 tiers tall. So Fort Sumter symbolized really the might of the United States government. Big construction project, an impressive, beautiful structure, built here to protect Charleston from foreign naval attack, built to protect the freedoms of Charlestonians, of American citizens. But it would have represented something else to enslaved Charlestonians, enslaved African Americans. The man-made island was built with enslaved labor. The millions of bricks used to construct the fort later, built by enslaved laborers on local plantations. So a fort that ironically is built to protect our freedom is built using enslaved labor. And later, before the American Civil War even begins, when the fort is getting pretty close to the state it would be in by the time of the opening of the American Civil War, not 100% completed, but mostly finished, as tall as it was supposed to be, but the barracks inside, not quite finished. The second tier of the fort, not quite finished. Certainly most of the cannons not yet put in place. And the closing years of the 1850s, in 1858, Fort Sumter actually saw survivors of the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade that had long since been banned per the U.S. Constitution in 1808, witnessed some of the survivors of that horrible trade quarantined here in Fort Sumter while the U.S. government decided what to do with these African captives who were liberated for a future of slavery in Cuba by the U.S. Navy. The Royal Navy, the British Navy, and also the U.S. Navy was active in not only patrolling the coast of Africa, but also the Caribbean, especially the area around Cuba, part of the Spanish Empire that really consistently ignored that ban on the transatlantic slave trade. They're liberated and confined here inside Fort Sumter, and they're in such weakened condition that an additional 35 Africans actually perish here inside Fort Sumter, while transportation is being arranged to send them back to Africa, but not to the Congo River, the banks of the Congo River from which they were first made captive and enslaved. They're actually sent to our protectorate state of Liberia, and an additional number of them pass away, unfortunately, on that voyage because of their terrible health from the horrors of the Middle Passage. So all told, during that time period, about 50% of the 400 enslaved Africans who left Africa in 1858 would perish before they returned back to Africa, but thousands of miles from their homeland. Africa is not one monolithic place. I mean, a lot of diversity over there, and we understood that, but that we couldn't send them back to the Congo River. We sent them to Liberia, a place that we pretty much could control and guarantee their safety. The connection of that story and the story of Fort Sumter and the secession of South Carolina is, though the ship is bound for Cuba, it was owned, captained, and built by Americans. So the captain, an American, is actually tried here in federal court in Charleston, South Carolina under an 1820 act that pretty much equated the transatlantic slave trade that's been banned with piracy. So local Charlestonians are very sympathetic. They haven't seen survivors of the Middle Passage. This has long since been banned. They're almost like curiosity out here in Charleston Harbor. Charlestonians come out here. They're sympathetic of the poor health of these survivors of that horrible voyage. But that doesn't extend to being willing to hang and execute a white American for engaging in the transatlantic slave trade. So the judge here in Charleston, South Carolina, rules that African slavery is not an act of piracy, pretty much ignores the whole intent of that law that was passed in 1820, and would later famously become the first federal government official to resign his position in the wake of President Lincoln's election in November 1860. Just days after Lincoln's victory in that election, he tells a packed courtroom in Charleston, South Carolina, that the Constitution to him is a sacred document, but no more, with the Republicans coming into the White House. And he resigns his seat and would later actually be the last South Carolina governor under the Confederacy. So what else does Fort Sumter symbolize? what would it symbolize to the Confederates? Like I said, it symbolizes their first victory. We're standing here in a ruin. Fort Sumter today certainly represents a lot of things. It represents the destruction of the American Civil War. It represents the brave service of the men who were here, and it also represents what it is today. It's part of the National Park Service, one of over 400 sites across the nation and our territories overseas that we're tasked to preserve and protect. The reason it is a ruin is because in the summer of 1863, again, if you could see through this wall, you'd see Morris Island, the Seacoast Island to our south. From there, federal guns start bombarding Fort Sumter in the summer of 1863, reducing this site to a ruin. So Fort Sumter locally has also represented, in the memory of the Civil War, the brave defense of the fort by Confederate defenders. Monuments are in the news a lot right now. The monument at White Point Garden at the point of the peninsula, there's a park there. There's a monument put there to the Confederate defenders of Fort Sumter. It's attracting a lot of attention today. You hear about these monuments a lot. You hear about the defense of Fort Sumter by the Confederate soldiers. It was hard duty. They were brave to withstand this bombardment. In certain periods of 18 months, the bombardment here would be so intense that incoming rounds would be landing inside the fort every 5 minutes. Over 44,000 artillery rounds are shot at this fort. Yet only 52 confirmed Confederate deaths inside Fort Sumter, despite this being the most bombarded site in the American Civil War, despite the fort becoming a ruin around them. How was that possible? Well, that's part of the story of the Confederate occupation and defense of Fort Sumter that's not so much told in the history books. The Confederate soldiers were not here alone. They had hundreds of enslaved people being brought out here to the fort to turn this fort into impregnable earthwork. So they're basically building bomb-proofs, underground bunkers from which they could be safe during the bombardment. And there's an account written by a guy named Jacob Stroyer, who in the summer of 1864 would have been one of those enslaved laborers here against his will, sent here by his owner from a plantation near Columbia, South Carolina. They're renting out some of their enslaved people to the Confederate government to work on these construction projects. And just a 14-year-old boy, he's threatened with death by a Confederate work supervisor if he doesn't go out during the bombardment to labor on the fort, and comments multiple times about witnessing the deaths of fellow enslaved people. We don't have a firm number of how many enslaved people died out here, but it's not just white Union soldiers and white Confederate soldiers who are out here serving and dying during the American Civil War. It's also those enslaved people who tragically are being killed by fire from a government on Morris Island that now, if they could just get 3/4 of a mile across the water, they'd get here and emancipate all these enslaved people. It's the Emancipation Proclamation. If you're a white Confederate citizen in 1863 to 1865, you view those Union armies as hostile armies of occupation, conquering parties. But if you're one of those 4 million enslaved African Americans in the South, you're viewing those Union armies as liberators who are granting you freedom. And if you're old enough and willing to fight, they're also going to arm you and give you a soldier and enlist you in the Union Army. So I encourage everyone to explore Fort Sumter and really consider what this site means to you. I mean, don't take it for granted that these parks exist. Parks need the support of our citizens, need the support of future generations so that we're still here and relevant in years to come. We've gotten about 100 years into our history as an organization, 100 years of the National Park Service. The second century is about continuing that relevance and engaging with you all. So feel free to ask any questions and enjoy your time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Let's go this way. They built these benches in 1863.
They look like they're plastic Rubbermaid ones.
They were. Yeah, it's when Rubbermaid was created. No?
I mean, maybe. You might be right.
God, could you imagine being out here and you're just getting bombarded nonstop for 3 straight years? Yeah. A lot of short areas. Let me out. Fire hydrant was built in 1861.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
These are just things I learned in history classes.
Oh, because you were a history major.
That's right.
crazy that it was as tall as that red line on the pole.
Yeah, I was reading up front when we walked in. They said this when it was built, it was 55 feet high.
Okay.
But because of the bombardments, they knocked it down to 13 feet high. So the original entry point was right here.
Oh, okay.
So that used to be their pier.
Yeah.
Right there. Also got bombarded.
Because, so where would Morris Island be? Is that Morris Island?
I would think it's that one.
Okay.
Because he said to the right.
Yeah, he said to the
gotta
right.
be it
and
right
it
there.
said it was only 3/4 of a mile.
Yeah, that's got to be it.
Yeah. Or it's that one.
Yeah, good. I guess
it's one of those. It's one of these two.
I think it would be that one.
Okay.
Because that stands out more. Yeah, that's crazy. I bet you the original entrance, see where it's like paved, like,
Yeah.
I bet you that was it right
I
there.
bet you're right.
Because that's where that pier would have gone.
Yep. Yep.
How did I get the lawnmower out here to cut the grass?
Sorry.
Excuse
I
this.
don't know. Crazy. Right here. Yep.